Welcome back to the channel. On this video we're going to be taking some footage, bringing it into Blender for motion tracking, and then we're going to take that tracking data out of Blender and across to Unreal so that we can integrate the footage with 3D assets and create a 3D scene. The thing that makes this video a bit different is this footage that I'm going to be using, which is of my cat Brisket asleep on the sofa, is a bit challenging to work with for a start. It wasn't filmed with motion graphics in mind. But also I'm going to be tracking that footage, and then I've created a photogrammetry sofa, a 3D scan of this sofa, which I'm going to replace in Unreal. So stick around to the end to see how that compares to the original footage. I'll do a side-by-side. So I'm going to be covering motion tracking in a few future videos as well, but I wanted to start with Blender because of the amount of control it gives you over After Effects, and also because it gives you a fairly direct route into Unreal. So for anyone looking to do this for their own work, this is probably the shortest and most effective route. And now over to Blender. So the first thing you need to do when you get into Blender is you need to go to this plus button at the top, go to the VFX menu and click motion tracking. That will bring up this screen, which is where we're going to do our tracking. The first thing to do is bring in the footage that you've shot, which you would do by just clicking open here. The first thing I want to show you before we dive too far into the tracking is I'm just going to get this piece of footage and load it up, and I want to show you the first hurdle that I came across. So you click open clip and the footage will load in. So this is the footage as it is. You can scrub along the timeline and you'll see the very first thing you'll notice about this footage is that it is soft. It is out of focus. It is really not the best starting frame. If you want to track something, you need contrasting edges, points that it can track onto, and out of focus footage really is going to be difficult. If you can, then start in your clip at a point where it's in focus. I am not going to do that, just to show you what happens. Anyway, so the first thing that I came across was loading this footage in. What you're supposed to do is check normalize. I'm going to select this under tracking settings extra, the correlation to 0.9, which is, it means that it'll find points and track points forwards as long as the previous frame has a correlation of 0.9, 90% basically. And also match the keyframe to previous frame, not keyframe. I did try doing some tracking when it was set to keyframe and the results were quite poor. So I've always had better results with previous frame. So once you've done that, you can click detect features, which will look at your footage and go, okay, we're going to find some stuff that we can hook onto. So I'll click it. Nothing. And this took me a little bit of a while to figure out. Obviously this little menu here has popped up now with detect features, and the threshold by default is set to 0.5, which is fine, but at that threshold it has found nothing in our footage that it likes. So turning it down to 0.1, nothing still. 0.01, and now you start to see a few trackers popping up in this corner here. Still not enough trackers. 0.001, and now we're getting a fair few trackers, but the problem now is the threshold is so low that the quality of these trackers is going to be questionable basically. So what do you do if you come across this problem? I took my footage, I bunged it in After Effects or Premiere, and I used an unsharp mask to sharpen the footage up a little bit. So even on this out of focus area, I can start to define some shapes. And here's what happens when you bring that in. Here's my sharpened footage. Now, obviously it would be ideal if your footage had some defined shapes in it in the first place, but I did mention this is tricky footage. So I've added this sharpen, and now if I go to detect features, it finds them straight away. Although I'll set the threshold back to 0.5 as it should be when you open the project. and now we actually have some tracking markers. And what I'm going to do for this footage, I'm going to set the distance to be lower. So this is the distance between tracking points that is allowed. Currently 120 pixels. They will always be a minimum of 120 pixels apart. I'm going to set that to 60. And now we get a lot more trackers down the bottom and on brisket. Correlation needs to be set back to 0.9, reset itself, normalize, previous frame. The pattern size and search size is really quite important. I did track with the default of 21 and 71 and didn't get anywhere. So I'm going to set that to 100 and search size of 200. So when you want to delete keyframes like I just did, you just want to press A to select them all and X and a little menu will pop up. Let me show you. Detect features. So I've got my larger boxes now, the larger pattern size, larger search size. Press A to select them all if you want to, like that. Press X, delete track, gone. So just in case you need to use that at some point. So these are my track points. Now, what happens, anyone who's used After Effects will know that tracking is measured in a certain error rate. So the error rate that I got from After Effects for this footage when I tried tracking in there was 1.5, which isn't really bad, but it's not good. Basically, you want your error rate to be below 1 and ideally 0.5 and less. So all I need to do out of Blender is get a better error rate than 1.5, and that's me doing a good job basically. So here's what we're going to do. We've set our track points at frame 1, which is down here on the timeline. So you know, if you click on frame 1, always set your markers at that point, and then you go to track and click track forwards, and it will do that for you. Down the bottom, the graph in the timeline is an indication that your tracking is working, and you can see that the tracking markers are moving around. It's got this red line which shows you where the tracker has been, which is useful to know what's sticking, and it'll also give you an idea as to what's drifting as well, which can be really useful. As you can see, the graph starts off quite thick and then starts to peter out as it goes forwards. That's because some of the tracking markers are gone from the footage, they've moved out of frame, or have not held in relation to the correlation we set of 0.9. So we are actually currently left with 5 tracking points in this first track, which isn't enough because Blender needs 8 solid tracks for it to be able to solve this camera motion. So it's reached the end of this first tracking, and you'll notice the frame's gone grey. That's because I forgot to do something. I have 240 frames in this sequence, so I click on 240 there. If I go over it, it goes grey. To fix that, just go up here and click set scene frames, and that's solved that. So it won't go further than 240. So our playhead is currently at the end at 240 frames. What we want to do, because this last frame is in focus, which is going to hopefully give us some better data than the first frame, is we're going to also click detect features on this. Loads of markers. So this might take a bit longer, but what you do is you go back to your track menu and track backwards. I'll speed this up. Okay, now that took a little while, but the tracking is finished and it's reached back to the frame 0. So now we've got this full waveform down the bottom in the timeline. It's quite thick. You can see there's a lot of tracking markers that have reached the first frame, which is good news. And now we have to refine this track before we do a camera solve. And I'll show you how we're going to do that. So I'm just going to bring this up a bit so we can see better. What I know about this shot is that there are 2 parts of it that have pretty quick or sporadic camera movement. So this area here is the first one, this is the second one. So I don't mind these big peaks and troughs, but what I do mind, and what we're supposed to remove, are tracks that go a bit haywire, like these ones, for instance, that don't sort of fall in line with the rest of the pattern. So you can look all the way down here. These strands go on forever, it seems, whereas the general amount, that most tracks seem to actually terminate around this area here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this waveform, like here. Look at this one. This one's just, where's that going? So that needs to go. So what we need to do is say select a track like that, just click on it and then press X to bring up the delete curve, and that removes that. So now that, just to neaten up certain areas, the neater we make this, the better that our initial solve will be, and then we can see how we can improve it even further from there. You can go back later and remove tracks after we've tried a solve, but it's good to do this first, because what we're going to do, I'm going to leave it as is there, and we click over to the solve tab right here. And in the solve tab, we're going to click keyframe. And that's why it's important to get these tracking markers cleaned up first, because what it's going to do is going to keyframe the camera based off of this tracking data. So if you have incorrect or just messy tracking data, the keyframing is going to be way off. I'm also going to click to refine for focal length K1 and K2, which seems to give good results. And then click solve camera motion. Once again, this may take a while. I'm going to speed it up. So now we have this solve error of 2.68, which is way over what we're after. We want 1.5 or less, 1.5 being because that's the best we could get out of After Effects, and this is a tricky shot. Realistically, we always want to be less than 1 and ideally less than 0.5. So let's see where we can get to from here. But this is, I would have said, a good start. There's obviously a lot of cleanup that we can still do. And we do that by going over to the Clean Tracks tab, which I'm going to click. And I'm just going to remove all of the tracks that have a error of higher than 2, for instance. So I'm going to type in 2 there, the reprojection error. It selects a whole bunch of tracks. You can see if we click through that there are still some attached to the cat, some attached to the sofa, but not many. It's selected a great deal of them. I imagine a lot of these have got average errors of 9 or more. If you want to see what the error of a particular track is, you can click on the tracking tab here. And for instance, I've got, let's select one there. So this one tells you the error for that particular tracking marker is 6.23. But we want to remove some of them in bulk rather than doing it one by one, because it might take a very long time. So I'm going to put in that 2 there, and then I'm going to delete all of those. And that was again by pressing X and clicking delete. Obviously the solve error is still 2.68 at this point. We need to uncheck keyframe because we've already done a keyframe for the camera, and then we're going to solve the motion again. And now the solve error is at 0.7, which is good, actually good. Really close to 0.5, not quite, but to be fair, I'll take it, provided one thing works out, and that is us preparing this to go into Unreal Engine. I'm going to lower this here, just zoom out a tad. Click on the camera. I know that I shot this footage with a 35mm lens, and clicking on the camera here, it says the focal length is 34.31, which is very, very, very close. So no issues there. What we want to do now is click on Set Up Tracking Scene. And what you'll see, what it's done is it's created a cube and a floor. The floor is kind of getting in my way, so I'm going to keep the cube. I'm actually just going to click on the ground and remove that. So we've got this cube, which is at the middle of the scene. It's lit right at the origin of the scene, but we want to place it within somewhere within this tracked footage. So let's see. We click, I believe, 3 points. And we want to set that as our floor. So we're going to click the floor. All right, now it's moved the cube here. This cube is supposedly 1 meter wide, so it makes sense that it would fill the screen like this. But for the sake of being able to see things, I am going to lower the scale of this thing. So if we scrub through some of this footage here, you'll see the cube sticks right there. Let me just lower this so you can see better. There we go. Scrub through that. The cube is now sticking right in front of the cat, which is exactly what we want. We've got a tracked camera. Fantastic. And with a decent solve error. Better than After Effects. Probably more complicated. I mean, After Effects is, after all, you know, the click of a button. But if you want something that doesn't jitter or error, it's good to have that extra control. So now that we've done that, let's take it through to Unreal. To do that, go over and click on your layout. Takes us out of the motion tracking tab. If you want to see the camera view that we had before, just press 0. And there we are. You've also still got a timeline down below, which you can, so you can still see your tracking and your cube. So in order to bring this tracking data into Unreal, it's pretty simple, but you do need to have an add-on in your Blender, which is called Blender for Unreal Engine. It's free and it's a easy to install kind of thing. I'll put the link in the description. You head over to their GitHub, and when you go there, it'll talk you through how to do it. There's also a couple of video guides on doing the exporting, but we're going to do that as well anyway. So you want to download the most recent version because the most recent version works best. I tried with one of the previous ones and I didn't get the result I was after. So download that, install the plugin, follow their guides to do that. So once the plugin's installed, you'll want to go to the right-hand side. There is a tab called Unreal Engine, which is awesome. Click on that and you'll be met with this menu, which you can expand if you need to. You want to select your camera, then select Export Recursive in the export type. Go down to the export settings and make sure cameras are selected. And currently it says 2 assets will be exported. It's going to export our camera and our cube. If you don't want the cube, just delete it and just export the camera. But once you've done that, you can say export for Unreal Engine 4, click that, and then at the bottom there's another drop down, copy import script, which is really important. Keep that open and we're going to head over to Unreal. There's a couple of plugins to activate in Unreal so that this will work. So here we are in Unreal Engine. Now, the first thing you need to do before we import anything is to go to the settings and the plugins, because there are 3 plugins you need to enable that will allow the sequences from Blender to come in. In the plugins search bar, type in script and you'll be met with a few options. There are 3 that you need to enable. One of them is Editor Scripting Utilities, which is currently already enabled. Python Editor Script plugin, which is currently already enabled as well. You'll also need Sequencer Scripting, which we're going to click Enable on, and that should do it. So restart your Unreal. Back in Blender, now that we've enabled those plugins, you can click Copy Import Script, which is just below the Export for Unreal button. If you click that, that'll be copied and you'll be able to paste that into Unreal. So here we are, ready. Let's give this a go, fingers crossed. If you go to your window and developer tools, you should have your output log. You can also press the tilde key, and in here you should just be able to paste that from Blender, and it brings up the Save Asset As menu, which you can call whatever you want. I'll keep it as my sequence and click Save. That brings up the sequence, which is, there it is, that's brilliant. So what you've got now is a camera cuts sequence with an imported camera which has all of the keyframes to its position in transform right here. Everything else is keyframed, so if you, for instance, wanted to change the focus or anything like that, you would have to delete those keyframes from the camera. But for the moment, we're good. So I'm just going to drag this and attach it to my content browser. So now if we look through this camera, what should happen is it should move relatively similar to the shot. Now, that looks good to me. But there is an issue that we need to solve, and I know that the camera motion that I made doesn't take up a lot of space. But if we look at this, considering the scale of this scene, you've got chairs and everything. If I scrub through here, the camera appears to move quite far. The motion's correct, but the scale that it's working at is quite large. So what I would do is select the camera. You can see it has its keyframe movement here, which is quite useful to see. So it moves forward and then around. The best way to move and scale this without going back to Blender and messing around is to just create an empty actor, drag that into your scene. I'm going to pop that at the origin point and just bring it up a little bit. There it is. Then I'm going to attach the camera to this actor. I'm going to call it camera mover, and then click the camera and just attach it to the camera mover. So now what can happen is we can select the camera mover and we can change the scale of the camera. Although, make sure you've got your maybe make sure all of the X, Y, and Z are locked here, and then you can scale that down appropriately. If I set this to 0.1 and press F to focus in on this, now you've got what looks to me like a fairly appropriately sized camera, and it does a motion and moves around. And that's pretty much what I would expect. But if I want to be more precise, let's say that whole action takes place over just under a meter. I'll select my top view. There it is. Each of these squares is a meter. So let's have a look. Where's the camera? There's the camera. Okay. Let's see how far he moves. Inwards and along. You could just change the scale of your camera mover, make it a bit bigger, make it 0.2 maybe. And now that motion is going to take place over a larger area. It's quite good. There it is. You can actually see the area it takes up when you click on it, because you can see the keyframes. So that's probably one of the most useful tips about bringing things in, because the scale won't be right to start with necessarily, and I'll be honest, I'm not the best at Blender, and I much prefer messing around in Unreal. So this works, so it works for me, and it may well work for you. Now, I've already pre-rotoscoped the cat. Now, if you want to know how to do the rotoscoping in After Effects with Rotobrush 2, I have a tutorial for that already on the channel, and it shows you how to do the roto and then bring that into Unreal Engine. So I'm going to link that above. If that's where you're at in this process, I suggest you watch that video and then come back here to continue this tutorial. So now what we want to do is we want to orient it so that the footage is always in exactly the right place. Now, first of all, let's just go into our camera view and make sure that the plane is filling the screen. That's pretty much one of the most important things. I'm just going to scale it right up. It's going to look a bit weird, but that is really fine for the moment. Then, with your plane selected, open your material. Now what we want to do is we want to get our screen position node, and we just select I think a pixel position or viewport UV. Let's try which one, see which one works. I can't remember. Hook that up to the UV slot on your texture and give it a second, and there you go. Now if you drag around in the viewport, you can see it always oriented towards the camera, and it will also change its scale based on the aspect ratio of the screen. So this is looking a little stretched because the viewport here is square. If you do that, it sort of squishes, which is fine because our viewport in Unreal, if we close that and save it, is 16:9 because that's the settings to the camera. So now we've got ourselves a plane with the cat always in the right position and tracked to the virtual camera as well. So obviously now we've got the scene behind the cat moving correctly with the position of the cat. And obviously it looks like it's hovering in midair. That's, you know, that's just where we're at in the moment. What you want to do from this point is start moving the 3D objects around so that they actually fit where they should be. And obviously you're going to get this weirdness when you're in the normal viewport. It's fine because when you go back to your camera view, it's going to be correct. I think the camera orientation is not quite right, so I'm going to grab the camera mover again, and I'm going to slightly change the perspective of this because I think it's looking down too much, and because I've already parented the camera to the camera mover, I can just rotate that the way I want, like that, which is quite nice. And I can also move it in space as well, like that. So with those techniques, I'm going to bring in the photogrammetry sofa and start playing around with getting those elements lined up correctly. So I've imported the photogrammetry sofa. This is it. It obviously has some holes in certain places, but the areas that I was most concerned about were in the existing raw footage. So that's this area with these cushions here, which I think look really nice. I'm going to show you a couple of things that I've done with this to try and boost the realism a little bit when using the plane with the footage on it. So if I go to lit mode, I've lit this in the way that the lighting was when I filmed the original footage. So I've got this lamp, which is outputting a slightly orangey tone. It's at about 4,200 Kelvin, so that is just lighting the sofa there like that. So that's my living room light, if you like. I also have a rectangular light here, which is serving as my window, and I've placed this cube with a basic brick pattern on it. It doesn't really come into shot, it's just to plug a small hole in the photogrammetry mesh. But otherwise, the other thing that I've done here is I've got my, what I'm calling my cat cube, there it is, and I've turned off the cast shadows checkbox on this, because when it's on, the software deals with this plane and thinks that it's casting a shadow, which would be an incorrect shape, for instance, to the cat. So what I'm doing is I'm turning that off and placing this sphere down in the position just behind the cat to cast a realistic shadow. Now obviously this sphere I don't want to be visible in the final render, so and I'm rendering with Octane, so here's how to deal with it. When we look through our camera view, here we go, we've got our cat, and there's our sphere. If I turn it off, you can see that it's casting a shadow just behind, which looks rather nice. A soft shadow, and everything is tracked and as it was in Blender, and it looks quite nice. But obviously we don't want that sphere to be in the final render. So when you have Octane installed, there is a method of removing objects and keeping their shadow. So let's load Octane. So with Octane loaded, click on whatever object you're using to cast the shadow and add an Octane object layer, which is just when you say add component, type in Octane, and there it is, Octane object layer. In that, with Octane activated, otherwise this won't work or show up, you've got camera visibility checkbox. So we'll turn it on for the moment, and then I'm going to start rendering with Octane. There we go, we're getting ourselves a render, and of course, yes, you can see the sphere, but if we go to the sphere and uncheck the camera visibility in the object layer, it's gone. And of course, we've still got shadow visibility checked, so you keep that. And that's how we get that realism, because without it, you don't get the sense that it's got that contact shadow. It doesn't look like it's touching the surface. So let's see how I did. Here's the end result, rendered through Octane and compared side by side with the original footage. And that's it. So thanks for joining me. I hope that's given you some useful tips and tricks to use in your own projects, and hopefully some things you haven't heard elsewhere. And if you've been with me for this long, please hit the subscribe button so you can join me on this journey, and I'll see you on the next one.